began, Pamela Cunningham with Mount Vernon, some of the early efforts at creating historic districts like in Charleston, in New Orleans, and they had this amazing vision for how the federal government should create a more stronger leadership role in the protection of our nation's historic buildings and historic areas, and not just building by building, but districts and neighborhoods. And they called for the passage of a new act, which in fact was passed in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act. And that's really where our nation's story runs up against Colorado's own story. Because in 1967, this guy, Steve Hart, became Colorado's first state historic preservation officer. Now, some of you may know that Ed Nichols is our current state historic preservation officer for Colorado, but the first one in this state was Steve, and he was the only one in the country who was a volunteer state historic preservation officer. So by day, he's a lawyer, and by God knows how he fit all this in, he was also serving as the preservation officer for the state of Colorado. Colorado was the second state in the country to receive federal funds from this National Historic Preservation Act, because it looked at land, water, and conservation funding, and back in 1966, $150 million were authorized by Congress in 1966 to go to state preservation officers like Steve across the country to do surveys, to list properties on the National Register of Historic Places, and to kind of be to require a conversation between federal agencies that had all this federal money and what they were going to do with it and how that might impact historic buildings across the country. By the way, we have never received $150 million. The most we ever got was $60 million in 1970. This year, Ed, what were we at about? And it's going to be a whole lot worse in 12. So Steve Hart is the reason the DNF Tower is still there. Not because of me. It happened before I got here, but because of Steve Hart. Because Dura, with their federal funds from HUD, came along with plans to tear down the DNF Tower, but their conversation about the DNF Tower passed after this act, or occurred after the act was passed in 1966. And so when they failed to consult Steve Hart, our state preservation officer, he sued them, or shall I say Holland and Hart sued them. And as he was quoted to say, they don't have to follow my opinion, but they have to ask for it, and they didn't. And so in not asking for his opinion, they violated this newly established preservation law. He sued, and not only did he win, but the decision was upheld in the 10th Circuit Court. So not only did Steve Hart save the DNF Tower, but he also demonstrated for the rest of the country that this law meant business, that federal agencies need to pay attention to it, and we had the standing now in federal courts. So it gave teeth to a law that was an idea in 1966, but because of this successful action here in Colorado, well, the National Trust sues on it all the time, and we usually win. Well, then there's still this idea of what the private sector needs to be doing. So some of you may recognize that this is Larimer Square back in the 1950s. And along comes somebody else we all know very well. And this is a gal from Salina, Kansas, and moved here with her husband, John, and was looking around, had 4 sons, but was looking around for something else to do to keep her busy. She got a hold of these buildings, and she thought, you know what, there's got to be something better than the way Dura is trying to get our cities revitalized by tearing everything down. Why don't we use some of these assets that we have in this wonderful set of historic buildings? So she purchased them. She got a bunch of her friends together to contribute the funds to put in to rehabilitate them, because at this point in our history, there was no such thing as a rehab loan. If you went to the bank, the only kind of loan you could get was for new construction. So the idea of getting bank financing for a project in Larimer Square was absolutely unheard of, wasn't done, not just in Denver, wasn't done anywhere in the country. For 25 years, Dana and her friends were the bank on Larimer Square. But what she did there was to convince the country that, in fact, older and historic buildings were not just important for their history and their fabulous architecture. You could also make money after investing in projects like this. So she started this idea of preservation for profit. And Dana brought Larimer Square online a few months before the passage of the 66 Act. So there was no rules, there was no guidelines, there was no, let me call you up and see how you did it. She was making this up and created a model not just for Denver, but really for across the country. And the other thing Dana's effort did was to demonstrate this lack of parity between new construction and rehab. So she pushed for, and in fact the tax code reinforced new construction and was not supportive for preservation. So she pushed with her colleagues across the country for changes in the tax code. And in 1976, this country had its very first tax incentives to encourage private individuals to invest money in the preservation of historic buildings. One of the first projects done in the country was Tivoli, back when it was done by HOK, and it was a shopping center at that time before it became used by the university. One of the next ones was Kittredge, and I just heard about another one that was done before 1981 with the current set of tax incentives we have. So again, Denver was the pioneer that it's always been, leading the way, showing the country not just the need for these policies, but how to use them. Many tax projects have occurred in Colorado and across the country because of visionaries like Dana Crawford. Well, of course, we all know Dana wasn't done just with Larimer Square. She next set her sights on Lower Downtown, which at that time was sort of a slum area, not a lot of empty buildings down there, underutilized buildings. Again, she and her partners got a hold of the Oxford Hotel, and I think they had to go through 2 bankruptcies before they actually got the project off to a good financial footing. But nonetheless, the Oxford became sort of the seed for the idea of a downtown historic district in Lower Downtown. Now, this is one I actually did become involved with. I think I went through 2 or 3 children during this period, and it took us a while to get this done. But to get these property owners to agree with Lower Downtown, this was a special area. Mayor Pena called for it in his Denver plan for the protection of it. Didn't really lay out how this would be done. We met with individual property owners, trying to convince them that this area was unique to Denver. It was that one area where the lower scale buildings still really existed. I think we hope that there be no building down here taller than the Sugar Building, which still stands today. This beautiful wall of buildings in Wind Coop, I love this slide. I think I took this back when we were working on this in the 1980s. Still stands because of visionaries like our now governor, who invested in buildings like this. At Wind Coop. The National Trust gave a loan to Historic Denver, matched with old Durham money, old Skyline renewal money that hadn't been spent now, that was going into loans to protect these buildings as opposed to tear them down. There's a quick before and afters down there in this area. And then, of course, in 1988, the City Council passed this very, very, in our view, strict zoning for the protection of the historic buildings and of that height we talked about in Lower Downtown. And that still stands today. And as John Hickenlooper likes to say, when he bought the Wind Coop, he bought it for about $6 a square foot, and now it's over $600 a square foot. So again, we created certainty for the development community. We created some incentives, both with the tax credits I just mentioned and also with the low interest loans, because still at this time in the 1980s, banks weren't doing rehab loans. We needed that low-interest loan money to invest in buildings like that. Today, of course, they are. So there's no longer a need for us to provide low-interest loan money for places like Lower Downtown. But we weren't done yet. Central Bank. How many of you remember the demolition of Central Bank? I know I had one of my children in the parade we had, walking down 16th Street, really trying to protest the potential demolition of this building. Again, our mayor, Federico Pena, was quite heroic in having the city offering to buy it, and we got stuck between lawyers in Cleveland and lawyers in San Francisco that said the clauses and contracts required that if there was a default, the site had to be transferred without the building on it. So they said, if we open up this clause, we open up the whole contract, we're not willing to do it. And of course, it was torn down. But it became an incentive for us to see if we couldn't do what we did in Lower Downtown for the rest of Denver. But up here, as you can see, we don't have that uniform lower scale that we had in Lower Downtown. This part of Denver in the B7 or B5 zone is where we have a combination of some of our older buildings and also some of our modern buildings. But we also have some of the most significant architectural and historic buildings in the city, places like the Brown Palace, the Equitable Building. But we also thought these are landmarks of the future. So what can we do in Denver to save this set of wonderful older buildings, but not make it difficult for newer, modern architectural buildings to be built that we'll want to see really for Denver in the future? So we started again talking to property owners one by one. I'll give you a secret. Never put everybody in the room together because they scare each other. Talk to them one at a time, separately. And we got amazing support for the idea of a downtown historic district. But it needed to be kind of unique because we weren't trying to save all the environs like we were in Lower Downtown. We wanted the new buildings to be compatible with the older ones. We wanted the new buildings to be new and be built in modern architectural designs. We just wanted to make sure this set of historic buildings, you can see how this was happening right there, would be in Denver in 2050, in 2075. So, and at that time, a lot of them had already been protected. This, of course, is the Denver Dry. This was one of my favorites, the old Joslin building, which is today Courtyard by Marriott. Underneath that, Here's a few more just to give you some of the befores and afters. And a lot of that investment had already been done. So the property owners